read a couple of passages from the Peddlers. I'll tell you how this book project started. When I was a kid, I spent time with my grandparents down in Weymouth, western Nova Scotia, and they lived out in the country, and this would be back in the 50s. And every week during the summertime, and as far as I now know, also in the winter, but every week in the summertime, there was a guy came around with a truck, had a box on the back of it, and inside was like a mini store. And he would go from one farm to another. Not everybody in the country in those days had vehicles. And he would drive into their yards, and they could buy their cornflakes and dry goods and different things off of the truck. This lady knows because she's seen that. And when I was a kid, I was fascinated with that. I thought, isn't that wonderful? A store on wheels. So this gentleman whose picture is on the cover of the book, his name is Freddie Manzer. And he's the guy who used to come around with the grocery truck to my grandparents' place. And after I'd written the other two books, I was looking for another topic to write about. And I thought about that, because that was quite prevalent around the Maritimes in those days. It happened all over the place. There were trucks and there were peddlers who went door to door. So I started to do some research. And I did know at that time when I started work on this book that Alfred Fuller of Fuller Brush Company was a Nova Scotian. I did know that much, but I didn't know very much about him. And I figured that's a good place to start. Alfred Fuller was born and raised in Berwick, Nova Scotia, went away to New England, or the Boston States as they used to call them, when he was very young, when he was 18. And the first 3 jobs that he had in the States he got fired from. He had some problems, but they were beyond his control. He was just kind of an awkward sort of guy, and he did some things that put him out of the job. So he'd had an older brother who had sold brushes in New England, and he thought he'd like to do that. So he went to the company that his brother had worked for, and that's how he got started in the brush business, and from that started to manufacture his own brushes, Fuller Brush, which eventually became big dollar company, multi-million-dollar business, and it was known all over the world. But the reason I like writing this kind of book is people in the Maritimes don't always know what a track record we have. And Alfred Fuller of Fuller Brush was from Nova Scotia. And most of the stories in here are about Nova Scotia peddlers. Now, I worked at CKBW Radio in Bridgewater when I first started broadcasting. And I knew at the time one of the founders of that station had been a peddler, but again, I didn't know much about him. So when I was writing this book, I went to Bridgewater to interview his son that I had worked with, and he told me his dad's story. And his father had been a Raleigh door-to-door salesman, but he always had a love for radio, and he had promised himself when he was younger that someday he was going to start a radio station. And in 1947, Christmas Eve, in a blinding snowstorm, his dream came true. And he signed on CKBW Radio, and that fulfilled his dream. There was another gentleman in Bridgewater who ran a men's clothing store, and he was from Lebanon originally, and I used to buy clothes from him, and I talked to his son on the same trip to Bridgewater and got his story. His name was Rofi, Herman Rofi, and he came as what they call a pack peddler. They used to travel through the country, the back roads, all the dirt roads, and they were laden down with 75 to 100 pounds of merchandise, and they'd go door to door and sell it. And if they were out for the whole day, which most of them were, they'd probably stay in someone's house overnight, barter with them, give them a cake of soap or some little trinket, and stay there overnight and then move on to the rest of the community or to another community the next day. Sometimes people from this area ask me, how did I ever get on to the story of the little peddler, as it's known locally, who is buried in the Moose, I was going to say Moose River, it's Moose Brook Cemetery. That story came to me in a strange way. One of the things that I enjoy most about writing is the people that you meet and the research. The research to me is an adventure. Writing the book is telling the story of the adventure. And I was at Sackville one day at a country show, and some of you know Jerry McClellan and his wife. They asked me what I was writing about because they had read the All Hands Lost book. They asked me what I was writing about, and I said, I'm working on a book about peddlers. And Jerry asked me, he said, have you ever heard of the Tennessee Peddler? And I had not. So he helped me get started on that, and then another friend of mine from out this way, he told me that his grandfather had lived in the community at the time of the murder and was only 10 years of age when it happened. And he had not been an eyewitness to the murder, but he was an eyewitness to the arrest of the person who committed the murder. And that story is in here. That's how I got that story. I did a lot of research to get all of the details. The Nova Scotia archives are a wonderful place to go to look through the old newspapers, the old Hants Journal, all of that stuff, because that murder took place over 100 years ago, about 119 years ago, as I recall. And the only place you're going to find any record of that would be in the Nova Scotia archives, or now in this book. And newspaper files are great. And the one thing that really did a great job for this book, for that particular chapter, was there was a cassette tape of the gentleman who, when he was 10 years old, was a witness to the arrest of the perpetrator of the crime. And I was able to get a copy of that tape and listen to it, and it was like first-hand information of that story. So that's how that chapter came about. Now, I would caution anybody who has not read the book or the chapter on Tennessee that the guy was convicted, and he was hung in Windsor. And there's a pretty graphic account of the hanging in this book. So I want you to know that before you wade into it, if you haven't already. Some people don't like to read that kind of thing, others do. But it's pretty graphic. And I don't know your thoughts and views on capital punishment, and I'm not here to talk politics, but read that and then make your own mind up. That's basically where this story and the title of the book came from. And of course, when you write a book like this, once it was published last June and out there, all kinds of people have come to me and said, oh, I knew a peddler, I got a story. The stories are pretty much the same. The geography changes and maybe the product. But basically, these were individuals who went door to door peddling their wares in the same way that writers go out and peddle their books and their CDs. So that's the story on the peddlers. I'll do questions and answers with you, talk to you a little bit about research, because I know that you are an historical society. And down in my end of the province, where I came from, there's the Clements, the parish of Clements Historical Society. And I've been down there. They were interested in a couple of these books, and I've been down there and done the same sort of thing with them. And it is important to document and maintain local history. So I'll pass along some of the ways I do research that might be helpful to any of you. Some of you might be aspiring writers who want to write something, but the way to get these stories is usually somebody tips you off in the same way that Jerry McClellan told me about the Tennessee situation. I'd not heard of it before that, so I said, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll follow that up. So very often it starts with an individual, excuse me, who tells you something, and then it's up to you whether you pursue it and see, okay, is there truth in this or is there not? And a lot of research is going down trails that don't always lead to a story, but if you want to be a writer, you got to get used to that kind of work, and even rejection if your book goes to a publisher and they don't want it. If your skin is not thick and if you're not broad-shouldered, probably writing is not a good thing to do. There are always critics. But initially it starts with an idea that someone has for a book in the way that I had an idea from something that happened to me when I was a kid. Namely the peddler coming to my grandparents' place And that stayed with me for a long time. And when I wanted to do a new book, I said, that's what I'll write about, Peddlers. So then you do the research on it. Now, the research could be going to the Nova Scotia archives, and you can go in there and spend the whole day looking at microfilm and getting copies printed of old news stories. That's where I got some of the information for the chapter on the Tennecape murder at the Nova Scotia archives from those old newspaper files. Courthouses are pretty good places to go to do research if you're looking for legal situations or legal cases. But I must say, on the book I'm working on now, I wanted to go to the Halifax County Law Courts in Spring Garden Road and get some court records from back in the 70s, and I was disappointed to hear that they had destroyed all of those, and they only have 25 years back. Yeah, so I've got to find, now the stories I was looking for, the cases I was looking for, most of them had publicity, but now I got to start searching newspaper files, old newspaper files, to find those stories. But that's what happens when you're doing research. Sometimes you get lucky, as I did with the cassette tape, and that one told a big chunk of that story, and I could take direct quotes out of the interview with that 80-year-old man who had been in the community when he was 10 years old when that event happened. So the other thing is you can always interview older people, are a real treasure. And sometimes they have stories that nobody knows about because nobody's ever talked to them. And sometimes you have to be very patient and just listen. If you're too aggressive in questioning about the news that their siblings, their sons, in one case their daughter, had gone down with that ship. So people are the best sources. And when you're writing historical stuff, sometimes they may have the dates a little bit wrong, but you can always check that out again, go to the old newspaper files, and that will help you to get your dates straight. But the real story is in what the old people tell you. I think one of the reasons that I didn't like history when I was in high school is because there were too many dates and too many charters and all that kind of stuff. I wanted the story. I'm interested in stories. I'm a storyteller, and I didn't want a list of this is what happened over the last 10 centuries, important events that you got to memorize and try to write down in an exam. I wanted one story out of those 10 things. That's what I wanted. And I think that's what historical societies are probably more interested in too. By writing these stories and keeping them in your archives, you're preserving the character and the history of a community. So I would encourage you to, if any of you are working on projects like that, stay with it, stick with it, and you might be surprised what stories you come up with. What we're going to do tonight is some questions and answers, and I always find that the question and answer period at any event is where most of the learning really takes place, because people are asking you questions about what they want to know something about, rather than me telling you what I think is important and hoping that you'll like it. So don't be shy about questions. I have no problem with, if I haven't got the answer, I'll tell you, or I'll help you find it maybe, but I'd be more than happy to take questions about any of these books, or anything about writing or publishing or research, any question you might have. Yes?
There was, you had mentioned the first Canadian who did the interview. That was on radio. Who was the first person to do the television? It had something to do with the mind, I think.
Yep, you're right. Yeah. She was asking who was the first person to do broadcasting, who I had mentioned earlier. That was Frank Willis. Later got involved in television. And she said, who was the first person to do television at a mine disaster? And it was at Spring Hill. And it was Ernie Patterson, who was then the public relations officer for DOSCO, Dominion Steel and Coal Company. And he was on site there representing the company, but Ernie had been a journalist. And after he retired from that job, he started a radio station in Dartmouth. But he was the guy who did the briefings at the Spring Hill mine disaster, the first one. And that was the first television coverage of a live event, of a live news event. Although it was tragic, it was still the first television coverage of a live event. And a lot of people don't know that. The Americans were behind us on that. But it was Ernie Patterson. CBC, television had just come in, it was in the 50s. And CBC went to Spring Hill, and Ernie Patterson briefed the media every day. Yeah, good question.
There was another one though, in the mine, and wasn't it in Halifax County? And something seems to tell me, is it Rawhide?
You mean Max Ferguson? Yeah. His name was Max Ferguson. His character was Rawhide. He was a CBC broadcaster.
Was he not down in some mine somewhere in Halifax County? As they came up, it may be in my mind, I don't know which one.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm not sure of that as a fact, but it's quite possible because in those days, and we're talking now in the 50s and 60s, when radio and television were really developing and different things were happening, and a lot of the people who, Max Ferguson was on Gazette, and in his capacity as a staff member on Gazette, he may very well have gone up to Spring Hill. There was 2 mine disasters there. One was 55, and the other was 58. And he may very well have gone to one or both of those. It's not likely he would have gone down into the mine.
No, it was.
He was at the pit head, probably. Yeah. Now, Rawhide was a radio show that he did, and it was an old character. He was an actor and a writer, and that was, I guess you'd call it Max Ferguson's alter ego. Yes, dear.
In the song All Hands Down, or All Hands Lost, you mentioned a lady from Windsor. Was her last name Larson, did you say? Okay, I was just wondering. I thought that was what it was. I never heard tell of that connection.
Yeah, did you know her family, or did you know anyone connected with her?
No, I was just trying to put the name to Windsor, but I don't recognize it as being a Windsor name.
Yeah, in the song, some people might interpret that to be Windsor, Ontario.
Yeah, well, I wondered too if that was Windsor, Ontario.
But it's not, and that's only because when you write a song, everything has to be lyrical. There has to be a flow to it. There has to be a timing to it. And if I'd have thrown Windsor, Ontario in there, the song wouldn't have flowed smoothly. It would have been pretty bad, yeah. But she and the first cook was a lady from Ontario. The lady from Ontario, Margaret Eddy, did some research on her, and she was 33 when that happened. And sadly, she had married a young soldier, and he had gone overseas about 3 months after they were married, and he never came back. He was killed overseas. So she went to work on the ships. And on that one, that was a Laker before it came to Nova Scotia, and she was on it when it was a Laker, and she just stayed with it. A lot of times in those ships, the basic crew stayed with the ship, and they hired deckhands and locals to go to work to supplement the work of the crew. Yes, go ahead.
Just a question about the Novadoc. You said that it sailed out of, in your song, you're saying it sailed out of Digby.
Deep Brook.
Deep Brook in Digby County.
Yep.
And where did it load?
It loaded in Deep Brook because the way it worked was the gypsum was brought by rail car down to Deep Brook, and there was a from Windsor and Hantsport, that area where the gypsum mines are, and it was stored in a huge storage plant that's no longer there, and that was because the Annapolis Basin didn't freeze over in the winter, so the gypsum boats could come in through the Digby Gap from the Bay of Fundy and load in Deep Brook and then go out on the high tide.
Yeah. My family was from Wentworth Creek. And
Wentworth Street?
Creek.
Okay.
Outside Windsor.
Yeah, that's my middle name, not Creek. Wentworth.
and my grandfather and his father before him worked the gypsum wharf in Wentworth Creek. And so I just was wondering, because I knew that right about that time, 1947, they were moving the loading operations to Hantsport.
Right.
So I was a bit surprised to hear that it was all the way down to Digby that they were carting it.
Yeah, I think they opened that in the 20s, and they closed it on very short notice. I'm not sure why, probably economics, but it operated for at least 25 years because one of their supervisor who had started with them in Deep Brook, he got a gold watch when he retired, and it was on for a couple of years after that. But the gypsum plant, as it was known locally, was a big boon to the local economy. Deep Brook's a very small place, and it employed about 25 people from that little farming community, so it was pretty significant at that time.
Well, it was the same in Wentworth Creek, you know, because they were carting out of the quarry to the rail lines that were taking it to the wharf, and I have a book that has lists of all the owners of the carts and how much they got paid per cart.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, I mean, it was a big employer.
Now they take it down to Wright's Cove in Dartmouth, and it's
Yeah.
shipped from there on these huge gypsum boats, big ones. Yes.
Were you able to find to track down Leon Lindor's, anything about his own family? When it talks about Azabouli's family in Lebanon.
No, that's one of the hard trails that you go down, and I couldn't find anything, and I couldn't find anyone who knew anything more about him, and I rather suspect it's because he was pretty young. He was 16.
Right, yeah, we always wondered too, even about the spelling of his name, and
Yeah.
I know it did a couple searches even of possibility of spellings of names.
Yeah.
But never ever could find anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious maybe if you had found something.
Yeah, the spellings that I had came out of the old newspaper reports, the Halifax Herald, or what was then the Halifax Herald, and the Hants Journal, and that's where the description of the hanging came from. And the way that happened in the days when people were hung, the hangman was always anonymous. He took on another name. Very often it was Ellis was the last name. It was different in this case, and I think it was the choice of whoever the hangman was. But the way that that story got into the paper was someone, perhaps the sheriff of Hants County, had tipped off a reporter at the Herald, and that reporter went down to Windsor, and the hanging was officially scheduled for 8 o'clock in the morning, but they did it at 4 o'clock in the morning, and somehow the reporter knew that, went down to Windsor, and he knew where the hangman was, and when the hangman about 3:30 in the morning went to the Windsor jail, he followed him. And he watched through the gates.
There's also a book called The Hangings in Nova Scotia. Did you see that? Because there was an account of it in that book as well.
Is there? I haven't
Yeah.
seen that book. Who wrote it, do you know?
I do have it written down somewhere,
Yeah.
but it was a book I came across and it had the story about that particular incident in it.
Is it a fairly new book?
I'd say probably at least 20 years old,
20?
probably
Okay,
at
what's the
least.
title of it again?
I think it's called Hangings in Nova Scotia because it has right behind it all.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, I'll look for that. I'd be
Yeah.
interested in having a read, yeah. Yes, sir.
Kind of a personal one.
That's okay, just don't go too deep.
Of the stories and stuff that we have offshore here on the waters of the bay between here and across. The waters get quite rough out there on the storms. Have you ever been on the bay itself to know,
And the Bay of Fundy?
to have a little bit of an idea, just of the small bay itself compared to?
Yeah, I've been in the Annapolis Basin and been across the Bay of Fundy 3 or 4 times. When I was a kid, went over to St. John, New Brunswick on the old Princess Helene, which used to sail from Digby to St. John twice a day. And I've been out to Grand Manan Island, and it's funny that you would ask that because this was when I was a television reporter. It would have been around 1978 or 79. I was doing a story on islands for ATV is where I worked, and the islands we chose were Tancook on the south shore, Briar Island down at the western tip of Nova Scotia, and Grand Manan out in the middle of the Bay of Fundy. So the cameraman and I went out to Grand Manan working on this project, and we spent the whole day there. And when we were coming back, it was dark, and excuse me, and I remember the night well. It was in the summer, and the water in the Bay of Fundy was as smooth as glass. It was a beautiful moonlit night. The Bay of Fundy is very rarely like that, very rarely. And when we were coming back, we were about halfway across on this beautiful moonlit night on this ferry boat that was pretty small. It had probably, I don't think there'd be more than 10 or 20 cars on it. And it didn't draw much water. It was kind of like the Dartmouth Halifax ferries. And we were about halfway across, and the thing took a lurch and went up and then down. And I thought, this is it. We've either hit another ship or a whale. And it was calm, as you can imagine, and beautiful moonlit night. And then it just settled right down. So everybody was wondering, what the hell was that? The next morning when we were leaving St. John, New Brunswick, we heard in the news there'd been an earthquake in the Bay of Fundy that night. And when these stories recently about the tremors in Dartmouth came about, my daughter called from Calgary because she was concerned that I was in that area, and I related to her about being on the Bay of Fundy. So, but I've never been out there when it's very rough. I'm not a very good sailor. I'm a landlubber, fair weather sailor. But I've been out there a few times, but not for any length of time. Bay of Fundy usually is pretty rough.
Yeah, I had a one-time opportunity to be out there one time.
Yeah.
I sailed with Katie Bell here when we went out to Parisboro,
Yes.
and it was a storm that night.
Yeah.
And it was dark, and the ship was about 80 feet. And there was water ahead of us and water behind us on the waves that night, just going back and forth, like, you know.
Yeah.
There was still nothing to be afraid of because of the boat itself, but
Yeah.
safe in it. But it blew me away just how rough it could get out there and just offshore. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, well, that's because it's very turbulent, because relative to the size of the ocean, the Bay of Fundy, big as it is pretty small. And when all that water comes in there, there's a lot of turbulence, and it's reputed to be one of the roughest spots of water in the world. Likewise, that Petite Passage down at the end of Digby Neck, that can be pretty rough sometimes too.
what creates the biggest roughness of the water is the shallow parts of the bay or a river itself. I do fishing on the Chivy River, so.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of going out in the Bay of Fundy.
So, I mean, I can understand why a lot of accidents and deaths happen in the water system.
Yeah, there were a lot of ships that went down there during the war. Some of them, the Germans knocked them out, and there was a submarine captured there by Joe Casey. Used to be an MLA, and he was had a fish plant in Digby. During the war, a lot of the ships went down, and that's kind of why the story on the Novadoc was not very big news, because at that time, keep in mind it was 1947, just after the war, but ships going down, that was sadly almost an every week occurrence. So not much attention was paid to what happened with the Novadoc, and some of the families of people who were on that ship were pretty upset that they didn't spend more time searching for survivors.
When you were doing your research on the Peddlers, I'm curious if you came across the name Alice Reed or any of the work that she had done. Locally, she would have been considered the authority on Leon Mundor with the account.
Yeah.
She did a lot of research with the Women's Institute. Kathy, would you tell me if that was the 50s or 60s when she would have done that?
I'm not sure of the year. I know that she had done it for the Women's Institute. She had written up a history on Lynchbrook and the murder. I had actually received a call from John Welton at the Windsor Historical Society, probably around about the time you were writing this. I don't know whether it was you that was writing it, and you were in and talked to John who it was. But anyway, he called me and asked me if I had any information. So I copied what I had and sent it in to him on the murder. But it was a handwritten account of what an older lady who would have been, probably, well, before my mother-in-law's generation anyway, like she'd be like.
She would have been a child when that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think she was an adult woman, but they like the gentleman that gave you the
Cassette tape.
cassette tape, yeah.
Yeah.
It would have, they lived through it, they knew that, yeah. And actually, the house that he was arrested in belonged to my in-laws.
Yeah, Huntley, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
They'd be up and sorry.
Yeah. I've not been aware of what the book that you mentioned or the account that you've mentioned, and I didn't go to the Windsor Historical Society,
Well,
so
there
that
was
would have been
somebody
someone else,
There
yeah.
was somebody else that was researching it at the
Yeah.
time, I know, and George.
Sure.
To
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
but it was a fairly good written account too of what
Yeah.
she had had.
And we have a copy of a presentation that Alice Reed did way back in the either late 60s or very early 70s
Yeah, it
on the
was,
history of Moose Brook.
yeah,
And when you can find handwritten accounts, those are good, but you still, in your research, you gotta check those against
yeah.
the newspaper accounts. And, they're usually pretty accurate. If they're not accurate as to dates and times, they are as to the period, and they can be accurate as to the character of the story and of the individuals in the story. So if you find those things, they're in doing research, but I've never heard of that account. Thank you. Yes?
I know that I've heard of the Peddler, and without divulging all that's in your book, can you tell a bit about the Peddler story? I've certainly heard of it, but I'm sure there are people here who haven't.
Yeah, about peddlers in general, is that what you
The
mean?
Peddler in Moose Brook.
Okay, it was two young peddlers. One was 23, I believe he was Armenian. I may be wrong on that, it's in the book. Odd thing about writing a book is when you're doing the research and you're writing the book, you're up to your ears in it. Then it goes to the publisher or it goes to the editor for editing and publishing. And by the time you see it back again, as much as 6 months or a year will have passed. So the first thing I do is read what I wrote when the book was back because you've forgotten a lot of it. And then, as you move on to other projects, you have to pick it up and reread it again. And I'll be honest with you, I had to reread it a bit this week before I come out here because I hadn't looked at it for a while, and I'm quite deeply involved in another book right now. The Peddlers were two young fellows. One was 23, the other was 16, and they were dropped off here by a peddler from the Kentville area of Kings County. And what they used to do, their family name was Curry, and they also did this in Amherst, and they're referenced in the book with the Mansers in Amherst as well as the Peddlers here. But they were basically wholesalers, and they would have bulk quantities of different things that were sold: cheap watches, trinkets, soaps, face cloths, that kind of thing. And that's what the peddlers would go through the country selling. So what would happen was the Curries would bring a few peddlers out to an area like this and say, we'll be back in 3 days to pick you up. And it was not heard, they wouldn't get lost because there weren't that many people around with vehicles at that time. So, you'd find them and they'd be going door to door along the old roads. And these two worked together. And there's different stories about how this happened or why it happened. There's various theories on that. One is that the older peddler was jealous of the younger peddler who was seen to be maybe a better salesperson than the other guy, and that they got into a dispute over that. There's another theory that it might have been as simple as a robbery. The older guy might have robbed the younger guy, or the younger guy might have tried to rob him, and in that somebody pulled out a knife. There was a gun involved, and a young fellow from this community of Tennecape had traded a good watch for a gun, and he had taken a cheap watch from the peddler in exchange for a good pistol, and then he realized he'd made a bad deal, and he went looking for the older peddler who had taken the pistol. And when he got close to the murder scene, he saw what was happening. He was somewhat of a witness to it. He was only a kid of 15, and he saw that, and he was nervous, and he headed back home. He ran, and the older peddler went after him because the younger guy was then on the ground, fatally wounded. So there's various theories as to what actually happened. The sad thing is you don't really know because nobody was there. If it happened in an area where there are 2 or 3 eyewitnesses, you'd have an accurate account. So all you can do is go with the information that you could find, which talked about all of those possibilities, but that's the way it happened. Yes, sir.
The stories that you've heard of peddlers, were a lot of them local, like from Nova Scotia, or was there a lot of variety from different countries or different regions of Canada, such as those two, that were from another country?
Yeah, a lot of them were from other countries. Most of the pack peddlers were. They came from the Middle East, and they came from Eastern Europe, and in Cape Breton, and there is a chapter there on Cape Breton peddlers. Most of the ones in Cape Breton, and we're talking in the 20s and 30s and even before that, were Polish Jews. And they came to this country. In Bridgewater, Mr. Rofi, Herman Rofi, came from Lebanon. And they came to this country because they saw Canada, and they still do, thank God. They see Canada as a land of opportunity. And a good recent example is the chocolatier in Antigonish. That's a wonderful story. But to answer your question, the highest percentage of them at that time came from other countries. And when you stop and think of what they did, it's remarkable because to begin with, they didn't know the language. And they walked. If you ask somebody selling today to go out and walk for 30 miles, they'd laugh in your face. So they were hardy people. They were determined. They came from difficult backgrounds. They'd had a hard life. And they came to this country for freedom and a better way of life. And that's what most of them found here in this country. And some of them are still coming for the same reason. Some of the other peddlers, and there's one in there that I wrote about, Colonel George Cox. He was originally from Montana, and I had met George Cox a long time ago, but I had forgotten that he was a peddler until I interviewed Fred Eisner. Some of you know Fred Eisner up around Lance, and Fred's in the book, and he told me some stories about some of the peddlers who came his way, and he mentioned George Cox, and when he mentioned it, I said, tell me more about George Cox, I think I know him. And as it turned out, I did. I knew George very well. And a long time ago, I had written a 5,000-word story on George Cox because he had been a circus performer when he was a kid. And he worked with Ringling Brothers. He worked with Mickey Rooney's parents. He worked with Tom Mix, some really well-known people in the entertainment business. And he ended up in Nova Scotia. And for quite a number of years, he and his wife and family had their own show and toured around the maritime provinces. So on George, about his life, and I was able to use pieces of it in the story that's in the Peddlers book that I got from Fred Eisner, because Fred knew him quite well. So, you know, George in that case was a transplanted, I'd call him Canadian because he had Canadian citizenship. He'd been born in Miles City, Montana. There are other peddlers in there, like Lester Rogers, who started the radio station in Bridgewater. He was from Truro. There's Charlie Call is in the book, who started Muscall. You all know about that. Well, that was developed into Glasgow, Nova Scotia. What else? Minard's Linneman. Levi Minard from down in the Annapolis Valley. He started down in Queens County, down around Liverpool in Milton, about 1840. And that's when he developed Minard's Linneman. Then he moved up to the valley, and he became a kind of a mail-order doctor. That's how he got his degree in medicine. One of the only ways you could do it back at that time. But Minard's Linneman is still around. Buckley's cough syrup. Tastes terrible, but it works. Yeah. So I hope that answered your question.
There was also in the book a female peddler mentioned.
Yes, she was down in Queens
Peddlers
County.
were not males. Some
Right.
weren't females.
Yeah, and one of them, one of the females who was mentioned is in the Fred Eisner story. A lady named Phoebe. She was Lebanese. She came out of Halifax, and down in Queens County, trying to think of the lady's name now, Seaman. Her husband was John Seaman, and they were Lebanese, and they would come into the port in Halifax when they knew there were Lebanese people coming in and help them get started in Nova Scotia. They would sponsor them, and both of them were peddlers. She used to go all through Queens County with a backpack. Yes, sir.
Do you happen to know the Schwartz's furniture in Sydney? Was he a peddler, the founder of that?
I really don't know.
He's Jewish, so I thought
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, he might have been. The only Schwartz that I am aware of was the one who, from Halifax, started a coffee grinding mill, small operation, way back about 1820. And he ended up selling spices door to door in Nova Scotia. And today, Schwartz spices are still around, owned by a different company, of course. There was another question over here, I think, yeah.
The Peddlers, I think the first one I remember was a guy that came around with a horse and a wagon, more or less, that was covered in. Did you cover that in your book?
Yeah, there's a story in the Cape Breton section. And one of the ladies who lives in the apartment building where I live, she found out that I was writing a book, and she told me about her grandfather knowing these peddlers who came from Eastern Europe. And they didn't have a lot when they got here. And there was one guy who finally had made enough money to buy a horse and wagon. And his wagon was falling apart, and her grandfather built him a new wagon free of charge. And that's in the chapter on, it's called the Cape Breton Connection. Yes, dear?
Did you know that Levi Minard was buried in Hants County?
I did not know that.
In West Gore.
Okay, that's interesting. Because Alfred Fuller is buried in Wellsford, down near Berwick, a little north of Berwick. And he's buried there, and it's a lovely spot in the cemetery, and he left a lot of money behind to take care of the whole cemetery, not just his portion. And his nephew.
Levi Minard was so well healed.
No, when Minard died, and it's in the book, I think his estate was worth $1,500, something like that. But that was a little bit of money back then. But it's in the book.
He was an itinerant preacher, I guess, too. And
Yep, and a mail order doctor. Yep. We've had some interesting people, you know, and go back at the beginning of the book, I talk about Sam Slick. Well, Sam Slick was a fictional character, but he was based on a peddler. And Judge Halliburton wrote those fictional accounts of the Yankee clock peddler. And that was Sam Slick. Basically, he was, today you'd call him a scam artist. And then there was a period in the 50s you'd call him a snake oil salesman.
Weren't you famous with a short reading?
Yes, I forgot to do that, didn't I? I'll be happy to read for you. I'm going to read first a little bit from the Alfred Fuller chapter, and the co-writer, and I got some of the stories out of that. So this goes back to when Alfred Fuller left his home in Wellsford down near Berwick, Nova Scotia. As was the custom among rural families in that era being just at the turn of the last century, none of the Fuller children received much formal education, but all 12 had attended the nearby Wellsford District School until they were 16 years of age. It gave each of them the equivalent of grade 8. Armed with his grade school education and with $75 in his pocket that he had earned as a field hand the previous summer, Alfred left home, bound for Somerville, Massachusetts, to live there with Annie, one of his married sisters. On the morning of his departure, after his mother had presented him with a pocket version of the King James Bible and bid him a misty-eyed farewell, his father drove him by horse and buggy to the Dominion Atlantic Railway Station in Berwick to catch the 11 o'clock train. From there, it would take nearly a day to reach Yarmouth, where he boarded a steamship that took him to Boston. 2 years would pass before Fuller connected with William Staples. Now, William Staples had been his late brother's partner in brush-making business. So it was 2 years before he met William Staples and began selling brushes door to door in what was destined to become, in almost Cinderella-like fashion, one of the most successful businesses in American history. Alfred sold brushes for Staples' Somerville Brush and Mop Company for almost a year. His commission amounted to $30 to $35 a week, a very good wage for that time, and he managed to save $375. He was doing well financially and developing his skills as a salesman. There were even some humorous encounters as he went door to door with his wares. He wrote of one such encounter in his book, A Foot in the Door. So I'm quoting from his book now. At another house, a big red-haired woman was intrigued with the brushes, but she seemed more interested in the fact that there was a man in the house. This became a little obvious, but I ignored it and continued my sales talk. So she tried attack with a strong double meaning. "Do not lead me into temptation," she said coyly. "But it is dangerous to quote scripture to a Bible student," and I replied, "Madam, I am not leading you into temptation, but delivering you from evil." She laughed and bought 3 brushes. Had to put that in. I'm going to read now from the Untitled Chapter. It's not humorous at all, but I don't want to leave you on a sad note, but this is a part that I've chosen to read. And this chapter is called The Little Peddler, Murder in Tennessee. On October the 22nd, 1902, 16-year-old Leon Lundor was murdered. His throat was slashed and he was bludgeoned to death by his peddling partner, Cyan Azaboli. The motive was never quite clear. There was some suggestion that it may have had political and religious overtones rooted in the Turkish-Armenian conflict at that time in their homelands, Azaboli being a Turk and Lundor an Armenian. But that was only speculation. Some said it was competitive jealousy, friction, because one was a better salesman than the other. It was also suggested that it may have been merely a simple robbery, the older man stealing $10 or $11 from his colleague. Others said it was an argument over a watch, but the watch dispute was actually with one of the young villagers, Edward Church. In a recorded interview in 1980, Everett Huntley, then 88 years of age, stated, quote, "The murder was witnessed by a 15-year-old boy. That boy was Edward Church, who earlier in the day had traded a good revolver for a cheap watch. After having second thoughts about the deal, Church went looking for the peddlers in hopes of getting his revolver back. As he got closer to where Azaboli and Lundor had stopped near an abandoned mine shaft, he heard the screams of the dying youth. When he approached the crime scene and saw what was happening, he panicked, turned, and fled. Azaboli gave chase, but Church managed to escape. Rupert Bryson and a friend were returning home from bird hunting that day when they met Azaboli along the roadway. They noticed some trinkets scattered on the ground and saw that he was carrying 2 packs. That aroused their suspicions and led to their discovery of Lundor's body near the mine shaft. Several men from the village, including the 2 hunters, went in search of Azaboli. They found him having supper at the home of the Huntley family. Everett said the peddler was to stay all night, a common practice in those days. He recalled that his family, although unaware of the crime, did notice something suspicious about the young peddler. Quote again, "He had his coat on wrong side out because there was blood on his coat sleeves. After supper was cleared away, he got his pack opened. First thing we knew, the kitchen door opened and 5 men rushed right in. One had a revolver. 5 men came to get him, and there was 1 man down by the road as a standby in case he tried to get away." 10-year-old Everett witnessed the entire episode. His father, Henry B. Huntley, resisted briefly. Again, a quote, "My father reached for a stick of wood and asked the men, 'Where is your authority?' They said, 'This man murdered a man.' At that, they made a citizen's arrest and took Azaboli into custody. They tied him up and took him to the old blacksmith shop. Next day, they took him from the blacksmith shop up to the old store and kept him there until Magistrate George Smith came along. After his arrest, Azaboli claimed Edward Church had shot Lundor. However, a coroner's jury concluded that Lundor, quote, came to his death at the hands of his comrade, unquote. Following an inquest at the local school, Magistrate Smith remanded Azaboli to the county jail in Windsor to await a Supreme Court trial. At a 2-day trial in early January 1903, he was convicted and sentenced to death. And that's it. Thank you. just want to say, I've enjoyed this, I hope you have. Our history is important. It's organizations like this and people like you who maintain it and preserve it, so don't stop what you're doing.